Good afternoon, Brockton 10th graders. Mr. Mulcahy here today on this chilly and frigid Friday afternoon. Today, really what I wanted to do is go over our concept maps as we look to take our Unit 10.3 test over the Thanksgiving break. So I'm going to share my screen with all of you so you can see the concept maps and we can kind of work through these together. So I'm actually going to start where we last left off talking about, and in this case, it was the Meiji Restoration. Now, the Meiji Restoration, this was the period where Japan underwent a rapid period of modernization and industrialization. So I preface those two words, modernization and industrialization. If there's anything you can do to remember those words by just looking at Meiji, that will go a long, long way. I think when you're faced with a multiple choice question, or if you are faced with a CRQ question and it's talking about this process of modernization and industrialization. So changes took place within the government, the economy, and social life. And within just a matter of a few decades, Japan became a modern industrial power and would eventually begin to build an overseas empire. It would set its sights on China and Korea, as Japan is a series of mountainous islands and they do not have the natural resources like Great Britain had within their own country. So this process of restoration, or as I like to call it, renovation, took place in 1853 when the United States and American warships commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry sailed to Japan. He in this case, Matthew Perry, presented a letter to the Japanese from United States President Millard Fillmore asking Japan to open up its ports to trade. Japan, lacking the technology, Japan, as you know, was cut off from the rest of the world, and it had a 200-year period of isolation, which ended with the United States arrival. But Japan really lacked the military technology to be able to defend itself from the industrialized West. So the Meiji Restoration, this was the period of industrialization, this transformation from Japan into an imperial superpower or an industrial superpower. So this all happened because the Japanese were faced with the American naval forces. Japan realized, hey, we need to keep up with the rest of the world, so we're going to go through this process of modernization so we could compete with other industrialized nations in Europe and certainly with the United States. So the Meiji reformers were determined to strengthen Japan against the West. They carried out this modernization by studying, borrowing, and adopting Western political, military, and economic and social forms. We see a lot of similarities with their constitution, right? Mimicking Western style governments. So the Meiji reformers wanted to build a strong central government. They chose the government of Germany as their model. A constitution gave the emperor autocratic power and established a two-house legislature. We look at the economic development. The Meiji government used Western methods of machinery to develop industrial economy in Japan. In our documents, we saw that Japan had built factories and then sold them to wealthy families. These families became powerful in baking and industry. The government directed the development of strategic industries, transportation, and communication. The first railroad was completed in 1872, and by 1890, there were more than 1,400 miles of railroad. All major cities were linked by the telegraph. The government instituted a European-style banking system. And by the 1890s, the economy was flourishing. The population grew. Peasants migrated to the cities in search of jobs. So there's a lot of comparisons with Japan and Great Britain. And just a few of those comparisons would be that movement to cities for factory work, improved communication. You had an internal railway system, increased entrepreneurship, increased urban pollution, a greater dependence on natural resources, harsh working conditions and living conditions, and ultimately class tensions. So, with that being said, Japan used its industrial and military strength to begin a policy of imperialism. Our next unit will focus on imperialism, and now Japan will look for colonies, just like Europeans had done, just like Great Britain had done with the United States. Japan had sought colonies as sources of raw materials and as markets for finished goods. Colonies would ultimately be gained through war. So, a few enduring issues we can relate or identify with this event would be the impact of foreign interactions. So, a couple of examples of that enduring issue would be the Crusades, right? We saw that Christian or European Christians traveled to the Middle East and the Holy Land, fought against the Muslims. So that would be an impact of foreign interactions and the cultural diffusion that came from that conflict. Also, the Black Death and COVID-19, right? The spread of infectious diseases that results from interactions amongst different groups of people. And lastly, it's the idea of cultural diffusion, right? The spreading of ideas and goods. So in this case, Japan adopted a lot of Western style political traditions. They revamped their economy. So other examples of cultural diffusion would be any sort of trading that took place along the Silk Roads in Asia, and any trading that took place within the Mediterranean Sea complex between Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. So there is the Meiji Restoration in a nutshell. I will leave the graphic organizers or the concept maps to you. Anything that you think is important, obviously include in your concept maps. You certainly don't have to regurgitate all of the information that you have in your first page of notes. Earlier in the week, we looked at the Irish potato famine. Now, the Irish potato famine is not a widely tested topic. You won't see 5 or 6 multiple choice questions on a Regents exam pertaining to this famine. You may see 1 or 2 multiple choice questions pertaining to this famine, but New York State certainly wants us to understand the causes and the long-term effects of this famine. So the Irish potato famine took place in 1845 when this blight or fungus arrived from the United States. It's interesting to note that the potato, a lot of people associate with Ireland and Europe, but it originally originated in South America and was introduced into Europe through the Columbian Exchange. So Ireland would be our case study. In class, we looked at 3 of the failures that led to this man-made famine, sort of speak. I say man-made, but I would preface that in air quotes. So first, we had the production failure, which was a result of the fungus called blight that affected the potatoes, which were the main food crop for the Irish people. We talked about that the British farmers, they would continue to ship other products out of Ireland. So this really left the people of Ireland in a really tough spot. We also looked at the production failure. As I just mentioned, the British, who controlled Ireland since the 1600s, they took the other sources of food like wheat and oats and exported them for sale and for profits. And then lastly, there was the response failure, in which the British government had a hands-off approach to intervention. They believed that the Irish had to be more self-reliant and that they could handle or weather the storm on their own. Obviously, that wasn't the case. Nearly 1 million Irish people had died as a result of starvation or disease. Millions of others emigrated from Ireland. And the famine really had a profound long-term impact on Ireland. This became a rallying point for Irish nationalist movements in the mid 1800s and 1900s, where the people of Ireland wanted to break free from British control or British rule. So, as you know, in our notes, there was that graphic that we looked at. Ireland's population was decimated over the next few decades, where you had millions of people dying of starvation, millions of people emigrated for the United States, Canada, Great Britain, and Australia. So there were large waves of migrations around the globe throughout 1845 and throughout the early 1900s. A few enduring issues that kind of come to mind would be the global connections and exchange, right? Interconnectedness. So examples of interconnectedness include the age of exploration, right? Led by European countries like Spain or Portugal and their role in exploration, the spread of infectious diseases. That is a negative impact of interconnectedness. Lastly, environmental impact is another enduring issue that is related to the Irish potato famine, right? The potato crop failing. Examples of environmental impact include the Columbian Exchange, right? That triangular trade network that took place between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. So those are a few enduring issues and other examples of these enduring issues. Next, we'll turn our attention to communism. Now, I know we talked a little bit about capitalism and communism, but the Regents exam really wants you to focus your attention on communism and Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. So in the 1940s, specifically 1948, Karl Marx promoted a more radical theory of like scientific socialism. So you may hear some people interchange communism and socialism, but they're very similar, where the means of production and distribution are owned by the people and for the welfare of all. So like I said, in 1948, Marx and Engels explained their ideas in the Communist Manifesto. I'll point out a few of those ideas here. History, Marx and Engels believed, was a class struggle between the wealthy capitalist or bourgeoisie. An easy way to remember the bourgeoisie would be the letter B. I think of bourgeoisie and the business owners. The class struggle existed between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the poor working class. So if you can remember the P, poor working class, and the B, that should put you in a good spot. Marx believed that in order to make profits, the capitalists or the business owners took advantage of the proletariat, and this would eventually lead to the proletariat to rise up and overthrow the capitalist system and a violent revolution in order to create its own society. So in this proletariat society, the workers would take control of the means of production and establish a classless communist society in which the wealth and power would be equally shared. We see this take shape in Russia in the 1900s. Marx's ideas would lead to a communist dictatorship and a command economy in which the government officials made all economic decisions. As of today, there are 5 communist countries that continue to exist, those being North Korea, Vietnam, China, Cuba, and Laos. So mostly countries in Southeast Asia. A few enduring issues related to the topic of communism would be ideas and belief and power. Examples of these enduring issues include the Protestant Reformation, right, with Martin Luther posting his 95 Thesis on the Wittenberg Church in Germany, the Enlightenment, right, these philosophers in Europe changing their focus on how the government and people should operate in society. Eventually down the road, we'll look at the rise of dictators like Benito Mussolini in Italy, Adolf Hitler in Germany, and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. Obviously, we see a power shift in Latin American independence movements when the people of South America drove out the Spanish. Thank you. Jose de San Martin and Simon Bolivar. I'll leave you with that little nugget. So that's communism in a nutshell. Once I'm finished with this video, I will certainly post a completed study guide on Google Classroom for you all to look at. So if I quickly rush through something, or if you didn't have a chance to write something down, this will be posted on Google Classroom. Now, with the Industrial Revolution came several reform movements, right? Reform really is a word that simply means change. So throughout the 1800s, reform movements sought to address the negative impact of industrialization, right? The workers and reformers were forced or tried to force the governments to examine and reform many of the worst abuses. In this case, working conditions for men, women, and children in factories, and women in Great Britain fought for universal suffrage, or the right to vote. So really what the reform movements focused on was that laborers wanted to unite and create workplace reforms, such as improving working conditions, hours, and pay for workers. This is something that continues to be an issue between labor unions and employers. Suffragettes, these were men and women who strongly advocated or supported the right of women to vote. Both reform movements had different means of accomplishing their goal, which was to have the British Parliament pass legislation or enact laws, which we'll get to in a second. But they created committees, they made propaganda, they protested. The labor reform movement, we noted in class, encouraged children to destroy factory equipment and machinery. Suffragettes wanted to get laws passed, so they took a terrorist approach. They had committees, they protested. So both had similar and different means of achieving the same goal. The effects would be that in 1918, women were granted the right to vote in Great Britain. We see a number of legislation acts passed in Great Britain. Parliament passed laws limiting child labor, regulating work hours for women and children, regulating safety conditions in factories and in mines, setting minimum wages, and providing accident and unemployment insurance, which really paved the way to the world we live in today as well. A few examples of enduring issues that are related to this event would be inequality and power. So whether it's the social classes in the Spanish colonies in the Americas, or the social classes in Haiti that were imposed by the French, those are examples of inequality. Power is one of the most widely used enduring issues, and pretty much anything that you can argue is an example of power. In this case, I just chose the French Revolution, as we just learned about this topic a few weeks ago. And then our next unit will focus on imperialism, where industrialized countries in Europe and the United States would seek colonies in Africa and Asia for raw materials and markets. So we'll get to that after Thanksgiving break. So we're kind of working this backwards approach here. So let's dive into the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution occurred during the 1700s and 1800s. Great Britain was the starting point of the Industrial Revolution, but industrialization began in Belgium, France, Germany, the United States, and Japan would ultimately industrialize by the end of the 1800s. So over time, the Industrial Revolution would spread throughout the world. It happened first, though, in Great Britain for several reasons. So Great Britain had a favorable geography. It had plenty of iron, ore, and coal needed for industrialization. Great Britain, as an island, had many natural harbors for trade and was protected from invasion. Rivers served as both a means of transportation and as a source of power for factories. The British had a powerful overseas empire, which had made the economy strong. They were able to extract natural resources from other countries like India, turn those raw materials into manufactured or finished goods and then sell those goods right back to the people in those colonies. The population growth due to the agrarian revolution led to available workforce. So because of things like the enclosure movement, fewer farm laborers were needed. So people moved to the cities where they could find work in factories. So there are a number of reasons why Great Britain was set to go through this process of industrialization. How it really took place was Great Britain went through this shift where the production of goods shifted from hand tools to complex machines and from human and animal power to steam power. So the how I kind of laid out in 3 bullet points for you to take a look at. People and goods were now transported through roads and canals and across seas and oceans. So the Industrial Revolution was very complex. There are many moving parts. In your web quest, you looked at several innovations, whether it was James Watt, whether it was improved steam engines, locomotives. So there are a lot of effects of the Industrial Revolution. Some of the key effects that we would want to note would be that people moved away from the countryside to cities, making cities having larger populations. We see the rise of big business, right? So technology, or with new technology came the need for investment and large amounts of money in businesses. We also see that since there were many people in a small place, it was cities and factories. There was full of diseases like cholera that killed thousands of people. And the factories, right, in cities created a lot of pollution. Our poster in our classroom illustrates that perfectly. One of the key topics of environmental impact would be the pollution created by factories, which is still an issue our world is facing today. So obviously, environmental impact and innovation are 2 enduring issues that kind of come to mind right away. Other examples of innovation include World War I with the introduction of tanks, mustard gas, machine guns. In the Neolithic Revolution, that was a shift and change from hunting and gathering to a more permanent and sedentary lifestyle with farming and the domestication of plants and animals. So those are just a couple of examples of environmental impact. So lastly, we'll get to our first topic of the unit, which was the agrarian revolution or the agricultural revolution. So this took place in the mid 1700s, late 1800s. Europe, specifically Great Britain, began to experience a series of major changes. Really, what these changes took place in was agriculture. So we saw a shift or transformation from traditional medieval farming techniques to more productive, efficient, mechanical methods of farming. We talked about the enclosure movement. We talked about Jethro Tull's seed drill, the Dutch 4-crop rotation system. So all of those innovations had a profound effect on society. So we have to remember that in 1750, most people lived in small villages and made their own clothing and tools. And over the next 100 years, dramatic changes took place in the ways people lived and worked. So people moved away from rural life, and this ultimately began with the agrarian revolution. It's the change, significant change in the methods of farming. Advances in technology and farming practices would lead to, as you see here, an increase in population, and that was caused by the increase in food production. Right. So let's just note some of the innovations during this revolution. The Dutch led the way by building dikes, earthen walls to protect their farmland from the sea, using fertilizer to improve the soil. The British had discovered ways to produce more food. The use of the crop rotation and the planting of turnips replaced the nutrients in the soil. Jethro Tull invented the seed drill, which planted seeds in rows and which made farming much more efficient, as you did not have to rely on Mother Nature, and hope and pray that your seeds would bear any sort of crop yield. So landowners found a new purpose for the enclosure. So they would take over the land, fence off large sections of land. So this was the enclosure movement, which replaced many small strips, smaller farms with larger fields. This practice made farming more efficient. Like we said in class, if one of you had your own large farm, you would try to improve agriculture production, right? Try to produce as much food as possible. But with many of these innovations, many farm workers lost their jobs, and smaller farmers could not compete with large landowners. So the agrarian revolution led to a rapid population growth. It's worth noting that with a better diet, women had healthier and stronger babies. Improved medical care and sanitation helped people live longer. And during the 1700s, Europe's population skyrocketed from 120 million to almost 200 million people over the course of 100 years. With that being said, there are a few enduring issues that come to mind that we can relate to this revolution. Certainly, with some of our other topics, innovation and environmental impact come to mind, right? We're changing the landscape around us. We're changing our environment to meet our needs. Other examples of this enduring issue include climate change and deforestation. We still see this as an issue in 2022. Other examples of innovation include the Industrial Revolution, and I'm going to give a throwback to the golden ages that we looked at during the classical era, right? Rome gave us aqueducts and advances in medicine. Athens gave us the ideas of democracy. The Han Dynasty gave us shipbuilding technology, the compass, gunpowder, paper, you name it. India with the Gupta Empire gave us mathematical achievements. They gave us metallurgy. So I'm just going to give a shout out to the golden ages that my freshman just wrapped up this past week. So with that being said, hopefully this gives you a better understanding of each of these events. We'll spend the next 2 days when we come back from this 3-day weekend talking about each of these topics, reviewing these topics, and then you'll have Thanksgiving break to work on your test, which would encompass multiple choice questions and 2 sets of CRQ questions, which you would see on a Regents exam. When we come back from Thanksgiving break, we'll spend the last week of November working on writing our first enduring issues essay of the year. So I hope you take the time and enjoy this video. Hopefully you use it to your benefit and feel more confident with the material at the end. I hope you have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you all on Monday.